QSO Today, episode 249, by Barrett W6CBA. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who will be demonstrating the new IC 9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver later this month at the Dayton Hamvention. If you're going to Dayton, be sure to check it out. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Summer G0 UPL's QRP Kit Company. Hans has an amazing catalog of radio kits and parts for every budget. QRP Labs will also be at the Dayton Hamvention and at the QRP International 4 Days in May event as well. I want to thank both ICOM and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Vi Barrett W6CBA just celebrated her 90th birthday. When I spoke with her, she and her husband Malcolm, KA6DJK, had just celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary. Vi's story is a love story that began with amateur radio in Southern California over 70 years ago, at a time before Southern California freeway gridlock and during the explosive post-war World War II growth. It was also a high-growth period for amateur radio, laying the foundations for the subsequent technology explosion led by the baby boomers. These were the years of historical firsts for Vi and the FBI that she explains in this QSO Today. W6CBA, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Vi?
Good morning, Eric. 4Z1UG. This is W6 Charlie, Bravo Alpha.
Vi, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning? What was your hometown?
Well, I was born in Los Angeles, lived in California all my life. It's a long time now.
Is it polite for me to ask, Vi, how long you've lived in the Los Angeles, Southern California area?
Well...
Without asking your age.
Well, I'm celebrating also not only just being a ham operator for 70 years, I've also been on this earth, I guess you could say, for 90 years. So I'm celebrating all kinds of anniversaries this particular year. And also my husband and I who's a ham also, KA6DJK, and he and I are celebrating our wedding anniversary this year, which is 65 years.
Amazing.
So I've been around a long time, Eric.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of expertise, especially being married 65 years. And nowadays, I think that takes special expertise, don't you think?
How true. How true.
Well, you know, Vi, if we were going to go back to Southern California at the time that you were growing up, what kind of place was that? Because we think of Southern California now as being, you know, it's got, millions of people in it. But what was it like then?
Well, the streetcars were always a treat when my mom and I would go into Los Angeles. Actually, we were probably 25 miles maybe or so from the downtown Los Angeles area. And going downtown was always a treat. The PE red car and the PE bus was our transportation and served us very well.
Well, you're referring to the Pacific Electric Railway Company. And as I told you before we started the conversation, I found one token from the original company, which I found is probably worth about 30 cents on eBay.
Oh, my goodness.
It's an interesting curiosity. What was ham radio like in Los Angeles in those days?
Well, actually, the hams were on the air until World War II, and then the hams had to take a hiatus, and they couldn't get on the air, of course, during World War II. So I think we were more like kids in those days. We played hide and go seek, and a lot of these games that kids nowadays don't even know about.
My father, who also grew up in Los Angeles, also they used to play Kick the Can.
Oh, yeah, we played Kick the Can and ran through the sprinklers on a hot day, and it was just more homey than what it is in this day and age. No, nobody seems to be young anymore.
Well, that seems to be the case. Now, did you have an interest in amateur radio, or were you exposed to amateur radio before the war?
No, I was not. I didn't know about ham radio until actually I got into a junior high area. And it was in junior high that I became interested, and my uncle Ed, W6HMW, was after World War II, started to rebuild his station. And, of course, after World War II and the hams started rebuilding, that's when I got first bit by the bug. And I ended up buying an HQ129X Hammerland receiver, and my uncle, he started building his station back. He had been a ham since about 1928, and I didn't know anything about ham radio that far back.
Did your uncle, did he have to put his radios in storage on his property, or were hams in those days required to take their ham radios to like a government storage facility?
All I know is that he was a ham operator, and he was the first ham operator on the air in Shanghai, China. And he was in the Marine Corps. One story that he tells or told was that he was on the air one day and he started talking with this ham there in Shanghai, and the ham in Shanghai said that he was gonna. He says, "Would you like to come over for dinner?" And my uncle said, it'd be very nice. Chinese fella said, "I'll send my car after you at such and such a time." And sure enough, the Chinese gentleman sent a car, and he spent the evening talking ham radio with him, which was, he was, of course, in his probably 20s at the time, and so I'm sure it was a big thing for him to be so involved with the ham radio. Anyway, that's one of the stories he tells.
You were 18 years old when you got your first license, inspired by your Uncle Ed. What happened? How did that happen for you?
In high school, I had a free class available that if I wanted to take some particular class. And so I decided at that time, because I was interested already in the radio end of it, so I decided that I would take the radio class. It just so happened that the radio class teacher was a ham. And so he said to me, because I went, when I was in the class and everything, that's when I got my ticket. Well, there were like maybe 7 or 8 boys and me and the teacher. We practiced. I didn't have my license yet, but it was just a matter of a couple of months or so that I did get my license. And of course, this inspired these kids, these boys, to practice and get their license. And out of that class, we got 2 boys that got their tickets. And so, it sort of was fun. And of course, I got an A in the class. But years later, when I went to a ham radio convention in San Diego, I got on the elevator and I had my convention badge on, and this man looks down at me. He's very tall and big. He looks down and he said, "Vi, is that you?" And I said, "Yes." And here it is, my high school teacher. So, those were the kind of encounters that were so exciting in meeting some of these people years later. Well, after World War II, the hams started buying up signal corps equipment because they could get it for a song. And so a lot of the signal corps equipment was converted over to the ham radio frequencies. And so it wasn't unusual to hear about the equipment that the hams were using, because they could get it for such a reasonable price, converted over, and they're on the air. So that was a big thing in those days.
Were those like the ARC 5 or the ARC series radios from the Signal Corps?
Yes, in fact, I had one of those and was on the air. Just, if you only ran 5 watts, you were running a big deal. It didn't seem like much, but you know how ham radio is. Especially if you got good conditions, you can get some places that are most unusual. So Ed started building his station after World War II. My parents and I, we were over at their house, and he was doing this rebuilding and getting back on the air. And of course, I watched him then like a hawk. He let me talk on the radio, and of course, that's really about all it took. Because once you're bit by the ham radio bug, if you're gonna be a ham, you're gonna go for it hook, line, and sinker. My mentor was actually Frank W6AOA, and Frank is the one that taught me the code and the theory. A very patient gentleman. My parents would take me over to his house, and we would have my code and theory that we would go over.
So when did you get your first license? Do you remember the day?
Oh, yeah, vividly. Oh, I did want to say that Frank was one of the hams on the West Coast that was in contact with the Kontiki expedition.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
That was Thor Heyerdahl, I think, was the name of the guy that was doing that, right?
Right.
So what happened?
Well, there were several hams along the West Coast that were in contact with these guys after they left from Peru, and they had to report in on ham radio to these guys that were along the coastline here. And then they had to relay that information back to Washington, D.C. Anyway, actually, they were on CW, so I could copy them, and it was really quite an exciting thing to listen to these guys, knowing where they're at and everything. So anyway, I wanted to mention that because I thought that was an interesting thing.
I think the only reason I know anything about that is that in the 60s, National Geographic did a special on television about the Kontiki Voyage. And I think he even tried to do it again, years later.
That's correct. And they had some harrowing experiences on board, and those experiences were all relayed back east to Washington. Actually, it was sort of for the government, too.
Oh, interesting.
I can't go in too much on that.
So I won't ask you.
I was before I got my ticket, I was a shortwave listener for a year or two, and when I got my ticket, it was in February of 1948, and my first rig was a Hammerland HQ-129X, which I mentioned before.
Right.
And I had a Meissner signal. We called them drifters because they would go up in frequency as they warmed up. But anyway, it was a 5 watts Meissner signal shifter, and that was the rig that I had on the first rig I had on the air. And my dad put up a 40-meter amphenol dipole antenna, and that got me on to 40-meter CW. And boy, it could have been somebody in another planet. I was so excited about being on the air.
And now this message from ICOM America. Create your own band opening. ICOM's newest SDR transceiver, the IC9700, is here now. This new VHF, UHF, and 1.2 GHz all-mode transceiver brings ICOM's direct sampling to the VHF, UHF weak signal world. This radio really has me excited by the possibilities of being able to operate moon bounce or meteor scatter, or with some additional components, the ES-HALE 2 geosynchronous satellite. The IC9700 has the same form factor as the IC7300 and will certainly complement your existing HF radios. The IC9700 all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features such as dedicated amateur satellite operation, color touchscreen, built-in D-Star capability, RF direct sampling on the VHF and UHF bands, dual independent receivers capable of full duplex operation, as well as Dual Watch, ICOM's feature to allow you to listen in two places at the same time. Output power on the IC9700 is 100 watts on 2 meters, 75 on 70 centimeters, and 10 watts on 1.2 gigahertz. The ICOM IC9700 is available now from your local ICOM dealer. If you're going to the Dayton Hamvention this May, be sure to stop at the ICOM booth in Building 2 to see the new IC9700 and ICOM's complete line of amateur radio transceivers for every band and every ham radio operator. You can become one of the lucky winners to take home some limited edition swag kits by visiting ICOM's website to enter the drawing by clicking on the IC9700 image in this week's show notes page. I'm grateful to have ICOM as a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast and appreciate their support. And when you buy your ICOM 9700 or any other fine ICOM product, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Do you remember your first contact?
My first contact was actually Colorado Springs, Colorado. And that was my very, very first contact.
And what was your first call sign?
It was W6CBA.
So you've kept the same call sign for 70 years.
Yes.
That almost seems abnormal now.
Actually, it was, in those days, the hams could have two call signs. They could have a call sign for their a portable use, and they could have a call sign for their home station. And the fella, the ham that had my call sign as his second call sign, decided when they said that they weren't going to have any more hams have two call signs. So they decided that all the hams that had two call signs had to turn one of them in. So this fella, who lived in Santa Monica, in 1928, he gave me the license for my call sign from 1928 because he happened to have the license yet. So anyway, he decided that he was going to turn in W6CBA, and so that went back into the files. It didn't come out again until I got it in 1948.
Was your first license the novice license?
They didn't have that in those days. In those days, they had a general. You could either get a general class license or an advanced class license. That was it.
So the code speed was 13 words a minute for the general class?
Yes.
So even before you could take any test, you had to bring your CW speed up to 13 words.
You had to pass both the test and the written test and the code test. So, I mean, it wasn't easy in that day, but now so we thought those of us that had gone through the whole thing of knowing the code, being able to copy 13 or better words a minute, we sort of thought that was not a good idea to change that, but you can't fight City Hall.
That's right. So I think we have in North America almost 800,000 ham radio licensees now.
Probably. My first...
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career after that?
Once I graduated from high school, Washington High School at 108th and Normandy in Los Angeles, I graduated from high school and my mom went with me into Los Angeles to put a application in to the FBI office in Los Angeles. So we went downtown. I filled out my application. That was in June, and in August they called and asked me if I would come in and start working. And I, of course, said yes. I went to work for the FBI LA office in Los Angeles at 5th and Spring Street under the big clock that's on the corner there.
What did you do there? What was your first job at the FBI?
Well, when I applied, I figured I knew how to type and I knew how to file. I figured clerical was the best that I could think of. So I started in being a clerk and going through the files and stuff for the agents and that kind of thing. But then what happened was I met the agent, I should say, the agent that was in charge of the radio system. And they had, at that time, they had 6 repeater sites around in Southern California. So when I found out that this agent was a ham, of course, you had to find out who it was and so forth. Well, anyway, we became friends as ham radio friends.
He was in a position to influence your next career move in the FBI. Is that correct?
Well, he was in charge of the system, and that put me, and I feel still to this day that he went in and told the boss, the special agent in charge of the office, that I would be able to be maybe the radio dispatcher they were looking for. They wanted to get the fellas at that time, special employees that were assigned to doing the radio system, and they wanted to get them off to do something else. So they decided that they were going to try me out and see how I did. Well, I started in being the first woman radio dispatcher and stayed there for 6.5 years.
Now, were you the first woman radio dispatcher for the FBI across the country, or just in the Los Angeles office?
No, and I don't know, and I don't know about across the country. I doubt it. But in Los Angeles, I was the first. And I loved that job. It was a wonderful job.
Do you have any stories from that job that you could tell the audience of the QSO Today podcast?
We had a company here called Max Factor, the Max Factor cosmetic company. To make a long story short, the gentleman in charge, Mr. Max Factor, was being extorted for a large amount of money. Actually, it was the fellow that was in charge, the agent that was in charge of the radio system. He was chosen because he sort of resembled Max Factor, and so they had him go out to the site where this extortionist was waiting. Well, to pick up the money. Well, anyway, he drove out to this orchard and got out, went over to put the money under the tree, went back, drove off, and next thing you know, here comes another car, and this person drove up, got out, went over, got a suitcase, and when he picked up the suitcase, the agents bailed out of the trees in the orchard there. Anyway,
they make movies from this stuff.
Huh?
I said they make movies from this stuff, right?
Yeah, you're right. So anyway, that was one of the exciting things. There was another one where it was also an extortion case, and the agents had to dress up like preachers and stuff. They had to be sitting at the pews and until the guy came in and made the drop, and then they got him. So that there were quite a few that were rather interesting.
Now, you say you were at the FBI for 6 years. What happened after that? Where'd you go?
Well, my husband took me away from it all. And I got married. And then once I got married, then we had children. And so until we got the kids into kindergarten and school, I didn't work at that time. But you were always an active ham radio operator. Now, when I called you originally, and you were telling me about your 65th wedding anniversary, I asked you if you married a ham, and what did you say to me? He wasn't a ham when I met him, no. But when we decided to get married, he had to take me lock, stock, and transmitter. It was the only way I would that I would go. It took 25 years to get him actually get his ham ticket, simply because he worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and he was very busy with his business. And so the thing is that I waited, and 25 years after we got married, he did get his ham ticket. Before that, he put up my antennas. He did all the hard work of keeping me on the air. And he knew that if I was happy, he would be happy. But anyway.
During those years as a housewife and mother, what were you operating?
Well, after the kids were in school, I worked for East Whittier City School District, and I worked 10 years with the kids from the classroom. But then I worked 12 years, same school district, 12 years on the switchboard. So back to communications again. I was switchboard receptionist in the office, and that was another job I really enjoyed. my kids were not into ham radio, but they would invite their teacher and classmates over so that they could see what their mom's radio, where she could talk all the way around the world. So I had quite a few of classes that would come over, and I'd have half the class one day and half the class the next day. And we'd get on the air, they'd talk to people, and so it was a sort of an exciting time for these kids too. So that was fun to do.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. I read an article, Vi, that said that you used to do international phone patches.
Oh, yeah.
When did you do international phone patches, and in what context?
We had our home in Whittier, I had a big antenna, tower, beam, but I never ran more than 100 watts or so. But anyway, I did a lot of phone patching, and also phone patching to families stateside here from the hospital ship in the South China Sea called the USS Sanctuary. And there was another one called the USS Hope. And so I did a lot of that. That was probably during the Vietnam War. So I did quite a few.
Wow.
Quite a number. I love CW and sideband, especially 20 and 40 meters. I have, like I mentioned, run hundreds of phone patches and messages, and the rig that I have right now at least gets me on the air. I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have my radio.
Where are you living now?
I'm living in a gated senior community, which is a very large complex here in what's called now Orange County. And the city is called Fullerton that I live in. And I'm on the fourth floor. I have a balcony that faces toward the south. And
so you can watch the Disneyland fireworks at night? I
can, but I mean, it's not like having them right outside your front door. But they're a few miles away, but of course you can see the fireworks. And on the 4th of July, the local college here has a fireworks display. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're on the 4th floor in a senior residential building. What kind of rig do you have, and what kind of antenna are you running?
Okay, what I'm using now is an ICOM 9100 transceiver, which runs about 100 watts. And because of these people here have been very generous about letting me put up an antenna. In fact, a couple of antennas. Anyway, my antenna now is 62 feet of long wire, and I've worked clear into South America on that, in the Caribbean and out in Hawaii and stuff.
That long wire antenna is inside the attic or on top of the roof?
You named it. Yeah, the antenna is actually in the attic, and and the long wire, because I'm on the fourth floor, I have nobody above me. So my ceiling is a vaulted type ceiling. Consequently, I had a ham that came and installed a antenna. The lead-in comes down through the wall and then attaches to the rig. But anyway, it serves the purpose of getting me on the air, and that's all I need to keep me happy.
What's your favorite time to operate?
Actually, I don't have any particular time. They keep us sort of busy here. We do a lot of stuff here, and in fact, they recognize my station, and I've joined the local Fullerton Radio Club, and so also the Racy's program that they have here, which I got started with some other hams that I then found out were living here. So we've got a little group. Everybody's older, so we don't do a whole lot, but we are recognized by the city of Fullerton, and they know that we're here in case additional communications is needed. So we're really, in the background, but we're there should we be needed, as all hams are.
So I'm going to ask you a philosophical question. What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now? Have you thought about that?
The kids nowadays all rely on all of the electronic stuff that goes on. And I just feel sorry that these kids have not experienced this, some of the things that we did that really was fun with ham radio. There used to be a ham operator on top of the mountains in Los Angeles.
Mount Wilson?
Mount Wilson. Mount Wilson had a weather station on top up there. The gentleman and his wife, they lived up there and had to give a weather report like every few hours or so. And so he and his wife would be up there. There's not much to do on top of Mount Wilson. And so they'd do their report, and then they had to send that off. Well, that is almost like stranding them up there with not much to do. So we played this game, Battleship.
So you used to play Battleship with the people on the
with the weatherman on Mount Wilson, and we would bet. Okay, I'm going to bet you a chocolate malt that I'm going to beat you with this game. And so, unfortunately, the results was supposed to be delicious, but we never ever did have our soft drink or ice cream soda or whatever. But that's what played. His name was Howard, and I don't remember his wife's name, but it was a fun time, and we did this on 10 meters, and it was great. At that era, also in the 50s, we had because we were all youngsters, more or less. My folks always invited the hams, any of them that were, that I were around or something. They were always invited over to the house, and so everything was fun in those days. And there was a drive-in on the corner of Atlantic and Olympic. I believe it was Atlantic and Olympic. And they made the best fruit pies. Lots of times we'd also end up going over to the drive-in and having pot pie, fruit pot pie. Oh, it was so good. Oh, yeah.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now? Do you like your 9100, for example?
Oh, yes, I do. Actually, I won that rig, the ICOM 9100, at the DX convention in Visalia, and so in moving here into Orange County now, I started out with a new rig that I had won, and it put me on the air, and that was exciting, very exciting for me.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool rig.
Yeah.
And when you operate now, you're operating mostly CW, or do you like to do a combination of both CW and single sideband?
Oh, I like them both. Frank W6CBA was a fantastic CW operator, and being my mentor, he gave me the good side of taste of CW. So I've always liked both. I haven't gotten into too much of the digital stuff, but one of these days I'm gonna try something again a little different.
The 9100 does both, does HF, but it also does, I think, VHF and UHF. Are you on any of the local repeaters in Southern California?
Yes, I am. I have a rig for 2 meters and 440. It's a Kenwood, and so I get on for a couple of nets. The Rio Hondo Amateur Radio Club net I get on for. I belonged with them since back in the 50s.
Right, because Rio Hondo is actually in the Whittier
area.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has been a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast for a few years already. The biggest reason is that I have an affinity for building electronic devices, especially kits that are well designed and delivered ready to build. Hans Summers, G0UPL QRP Labs founder, owner, and engineering designer, creates the most state-of-the-art transmitters, receivers, and transceiver kits at a very fair price to allow any ham to get on the air for very little money. Be sure to look for Hans in Dayton at the 4 Days in May event at the Fairborn, Ohio Holiday Inn on the Thursday before Hamvention, and at the convention itself in Building 6. I want to thank Hans for continuing to support the QSO Today podcast, and I want to thank you for always using the link on the show notes page to get to QRP Labs, or if you make purchases in person, by telling hams at the convention that you heard about it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to my QSO Today. And you have another net?
Actually, I belong to several of the popular ones. The Quarter Century Wireless Association. You have to be a ham for 25 years in order to join that one. Then there's YL International Sidebanders. That's a sideband net that I belong to. Then there's the Old Timers Club. You got to be a ham for 40 years in order to join that one. And then there's the 1010 Club for 10 meters, which I belong to. And ARRL just sent me a pin for 40 years of continuous membership. And so ARRL got in there. And
I saw an old QSL card of yours that was online, and it said that you had a Lads and Lassie certificate. Do you remember what that was? What's a Lads and Lassie certificate, and how'd you earn it?
A Lads and Lassies certificate is a certificate that the YL Los Angeles YL Ladies Los Angeles Club had. Oh, brother, back in let's see, I think I joined not quite a year after it started. I was invited to one of the club meetings because I was a new ham and a YL. And so one of the ladies picked me up, and we went to the club meeting, and it was a certificate where you had to work 10 ladies that belonged to the club, and it had a picture of a Scottish gentleman in the corner, and I don't know where they came up with Lads and Lassies, but anyway, it was a special certificate that you would be sent if you worked 8 or 10 of us in the YL club, and you would get this very colorful. It was a very colorful. I still have mine. If I wanted to, I could plaster the walls in here with certificates that I have. Got umpteen number of certificates.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby? If they were going to come and say, Vi, you've got 70 years in, what advice would you give me?
Well, if they wanted to come in to, get into the hobby, then they need to study for the theory.
Do you have some sage wisdom after being a ham for 70 years that you might share with a new ham? He's already gotten his license, and he's just trying to figure out what he's going to do.
Well, there are different avenues. There are all kinds of things, all kinds of programs that you can get, but you got to make the effort to step forward. For instance, if you want to make a challenge, I want to work all 50 states. I want to work counties in the different states. There are all these challenges that you can put yourself to. And, I still get excited over working something out of the United States. Just working somebody in the Caribbean or even out in Hawaii or up in Alaska. To me, here I am sitting in my own living room, and I'm talking to somebody in another country. And to me, it's amazing. It's just amazing.
It's magic, isn't it?
Yes.
It still is.
It still is. I still get excited about it. But a lot of them don't look at it. A lot of people don't look at it. A lot of hams. Some of them don't look at it that way because they're like, the thrill is over. Well, it's what you put into it and how excited you get about it, and that make you have that feeling. I just wanted to say one more thing, and that is that I enjoy field day. I love field day.
And what do you love about field day?
Being able to get on and make all these contacts. To me, that's exciting, and it also challenges your disaster communication ability to operate at extended long times, to give yourself a chance to see what it's like if you had. Well, I did have a disaster, and that was the Whittier Earthquake in 1987, when we had the Whittier Narrows earthquake hit, and the ham operators held the city together for 5 hours because a generator didn't turn over. And so if it hadn't been for the hams, they had me station them at various locations like the ambulance service, fire department, police department, different locations throughout the city for 5 hours. So anyway, it showed that we were prepared. I had set up the radio system, disaster communication system for the city of Whittier. And so that's why I was so excited about coming here to this location, because this is quite a number of acres that we're on here. And so consequently, you need to have extra eyes, ears, and be ready for whatever is going to happen. We know it is, right?
Do you remember the San Fernando earthquake in February of 1971?
Yes.
Were you an active ham at that point, too?
My cousin, who is a ham, and also the son of my Uncle Ed. We got other hams in this family. So. But anyway, that was out in the valley, and so we were about 30 miles, 40 miles, maybe 30 away from the epicenter. But that's our problem here, where some people have the fires and stuff. We got the earthquakes. I just recently retired as a volunteer with the Whittier Police Department for 20 years and 4 months of service.
What did you do for them?
I did just about everything in there except carry a gun. I filed. I just did a lot of different things. What I enjoyed, I even went out on patrol and stuff, but I enjoyed working the front counter. I enjoyed meeting the public, and so
Oh, that's amazing.
So I enjoyed
the company of the officers.
Well, yeah,
as well.
They were nice. They were very, very nice to work for, and so I've done quite a few things.
I remember that earthquake. I lived in North Whittier at the time, and it was just after 6 in the morning, and I was in bed, and it felt like I was on one of those rubber surf riders at the beach. I mean, it was really rocking and rolling in North Whittier. Yeah. Yeah,
and well, we had a pool, above ground pool, plastic.
Right.
In a pool in our backyard at that time, and when that started rocking, all I could think of was I wanted to crank the tower down, and so I jumped over Don and headed for the backyard, and I started in cranking the tower down. The water comes slopping over the pool and splashing in the backyard, and all these drips were coming down from the antenna. It was the water that had condensed up on the elements, and they were coming down, and they and I thought it was raining along with everything else. Oh, it was quite a time.
Right, you have to have lived there to actually know what an earthquake feels like.
Yeah, you do. We had one here that was very noticeable. It was I think it was around like a 4.9 or 5, and the epicenter would have been about a mile from us here. it really shook. But we, made it through.
Vi, it's such a pleasure. It is such a pleasure to speak with you about 70 years in ham radio and about your ham radio journey. And with that, I want to thank you so much for joining the QSO Today podcast and wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric, and 73s to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Vi. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W6CBA in the search box at the top of the page. I want to point out that you can look at all of the previous episodes of QSO Today, 248 of them, by looking at the file menu on the upper left corner of the show notes page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.